Good morning, prompt attendees. Welcome to this webinar on Biodiversity Net Gain. We will just wait 2 or 3 minutes for people to join and then start. Good morning. Thank you for joining promptly. Despite that, we will wait a couple of minutes for those who haven't joined promptly. So there's still time to make a cup of tea. I have my BDB Pitman's branded mug of coffee ready already. Good morning and welcome to this webinar on Biodiversity Net Gain. We're just waiting for a reasonable number to join and then I'll start. I'm going to wait 1 more minute and then we will start. Right, I think that's long enough. Everyone else is late and doesn't deserve to hear the beginning of the talk. Thank you very much for joining. This is the 3rd webinar I will have done on Biodiversity Net Gain. I think it's a fast-moving area and deserves frequent webinars because there's things happening all the time. So thank you if you're welcome if you're joining for this is the first time you've joined one, or even if you've been at all of them. There should be something for you nevertheless, whichever way it is. A bit of housekeeping. This is being recorded and will go on our firm's YouTube channel in due course, and we will also send you the slides which have hyperlinks into the documents I refer to. Please, if you want to ask me a question, please use the Q&A button. I will probably not answer any until I've finished my presentation, and then I'll go through as many as I can, and I will write answers to all of them, even the ones I've already answered during the webinar, and you'll get a copy of all that with the slides. If you're having technical issues, please use the chat. I'm not going to look at it myself. My colleague Megan will see if she can do anything about any issues you're having. Although, of course, if it's not at our end, then that may not be possible. Apologies for that. This time, just to make it even more exciting, we're going to conduct some polls just to get a bit of feedback on your attitude towards Biodiversity Net Gain. So why don't we open with the first poll? which is how important do you think BNG is? So you should get something on your screen. I think biodiversity net gain is important. Yes, no, undecided. If you would like to click one of those options, we'll keep that open for a minute or two. No, it tells me I'm not allowed to vote. Shame. Meanwhile, I'll go on to my next slide, which will set out what I'm going to talk about. So I will start by emphasizing why I think biodiversity net gain is important, or BNG. I will then do a brief recap on what it is, particularly for first timers, but this will be slightly adjusted to match the current metric and so on. So there will be something in it, even if you've attended previous webinars. My last webinar is on the 9th of March, so there's two main things that have happened since then. The biodiversity metric has actually changed very slightly, and there have been two guidance papers published, but they're pretty short. I also attended a demonstration of the Biodiversity Gain Register conducted by DEFRA, so I'll say a bit about that as well. There was due to be another one yesterday, but it was postponed till next week, so my just-in-time delivery hasn't quite worked there. There is a whole list in the government's response to the consultation it conducted last year of things that it says it's going to do between now and when BNG comes into force in November. I will go through the list of those things. Then I will do a bit of a step-by-step guide as to if you're a developer wanting to make a planning application, what extra things you need to do. And then from the other side, if you're a landowner or a broker or some person who is making land available for developers, what you have to do. And then finally, one sales slide on what we are doing to react to this whole new legal regime. Okay. Megan, can you display the result of the poll? Okay, 89% think it's important. And only one person said it's not important. Well, there you are. I hope to change the mind of that one person. And I'm not going to run this particular poll again, but there we are. Okay, let's move on. Why is BNG important? Well, in my view, I think this is the biggest change to planning since 1991, i.e. when the Town and Country Planning Act 1990 fully came into force. Despite that, I think it's not widely known about, although it's increasingly known about. I have been to networking events where developers are there, and I've said, have you heard of BNG? And a few of them say no, which amazes me. With only, where are we? We're now in June, July, August, September, October, November, 5 months to go, and yet some people don't even know about it at all. My calculations, there were 385 planning applications made in England last year, 2022. About just over half of those were householder applications to which BNG will not apply, but that leaves over 150,000. So even assuming some of those won't require biodiversity net gain, I think there's going to be about 100,000 planning applications every year being affected by this. So if you are making one of those applications, that's maybe a challenge, but if you have some land that you can develop for improve the habitat on, that could be an opportunity. And even for developers, there are opportunities. And if you imagine the area of land that all those applications are going to take up, more than that area is going to have to be found somewhere else for biodiversity gain. So that's a lot of land every year. So that's why I think it's important. Right, a recap on what it is. So from November this year, apart from small sites, all planning permissions will have a mandatory condition attached to them. compulsory condition that they must improve the environment by at least 10%. This has been brought in by the Environment Act 2021, and it's in section 19, which introduces Schedule 14, which has all the details. So you can look that up by clicking that link. As I said, it will come into force this November. That's the main start date. Although they have, the government has decided to make it a bit later for small sites, but only 2 or 3 months later, or perhaps 4 months, perhaps April, something like that, for small sites. It'll apply to virtually every type of planning application, not householder applications, but it will apply to previously developed land applications on that, and even change of use applications. So even if you're not doing any development at all, if the site you are seeking permission for has a non-zero habitat value, then you will have to provide 10% somewhere. So it's quite far-reaching. For development consent orders under the Planning Act 2008, this is also going to apply, but it gets 2 more years before it comes into force, and that's in the very next section of the Environment Act and next schedule. So I will be focusing on town and country planning applications in this webinar, since they are the first ones. So this land, it doesn't have to be your own land. I'll explain a bit more about that. That has to be improved to offset the effect of your development. And the government wants a market to be created in this land. So entrepreneurs, landowners, charities, all sorts of bodies are being encouraged to create this market in this land for developers to use. So it goes beyond even planning. So when it's a 10% gain, 10% of what? Well, let's find out. There is a metric that has been developed by Natural England called the Biodiversity Metric. I will go into how it precisely works on the next slide. But imagine that the land you're about to build on, you use the metric to calculate a score, which is called a number of biodiversity units. And you will have to improve some land somewhere else to the value of at least 10% more than that score. So just to make that clear, if your score is 5, then the land you're improving will have to improve by at least 5.5. It's not just the 10%, it's the 110%. So that's quite significant. So you've got to find it, and you have to guarantee that it's going to be in that new condition for at least 30 years. And the one non-numerical rule is that the value of the habitat, its distinctiveness, must always be at least as good as the one you're using up. So you can't just have a lower level, lots of land at a lower level value to make up the score. It's got to be at least as good. So you can see why that rule has been introduced, because the government don't want habitat to degrade, even if more of it is produced over time. Now, there are 3 ways you can provide this biodiversity land. It could be on site and within or adjacent to your red line boundary for your planning application, in which case you don't need to register it, but you will have to demonstrate to the local authority that you have or will improve it to their satisfaction. It could be off-site, so it could be some land somewhere else, even hundreds of miles away. That land does need to be put on this register that I'll talk about later. Or as a last resort, and this particularly is likely to happen at the beginning of this whole regime, because there won't be very much land on the register, you can simply throw money at the problem and buy what are called statutory credits from the government, and they will sort out the land behind the scenes. A lot of people, when they're talking about BNG, seem to confuse the word units and the word credits. So units are the scores, the score of the land. So that's just a numerical value, 1 unit or 5 units or whatever. Credits are the things you buy from the government. So you don't even know what land they correspond to. So those are the 3 ways you can provide your BNG. There are, I should mention, 3 separate metrics for land, which is the main metric. And then there's one for hedgerows because they are linear and so don't sort of have an area and have to be calculated differently. And also water courses get a separate metric as well. And you can't have less than 10% in one of those metrics and compensate for by having more in another. They're all calculated separately, so you can't trade them off against each other. Now, you could have done the improvement already, but it must have been done since the 30th of January 2020, very significant date, which was the date that the Environment Bill was resubmitted, reintroduced into Parliament. And just like with compulsory purchase compensation, you can't deliberately try and improve the value of your land. You can't deliberately or even just allow land to degrade on its own and then improve it back up again. That won't count. It's got to be what its condition was on the 30th of January 2020. It has to be better than that. So how does this metric work precisely? I will go through this briefly because I think it is worth appreciating how it works. But this is quite a complex slide. You can look at it at your leisure afterwards. So the value of the land you're about to build on, to get the metric, you multiply 4 things together. One is simply its area in hectares. So let's have an example of an area of 1 hectare. The second one is the distinctiveness of the habitat, which I mentioned briefly earlier. That can vary between 0 and 8. So 0 is a non-habitat really. So if it's just hard standing, there's nothing growing on it at all, then you will get a habitat of 0, distinctiveness of 0 rather. And 10% of 0 is 0, so you actually won't have to provide any B&G. So you're in the clear on that if that's your distinctiveness. And the highest it can be is 8 for things like a blanket to bog. So you have to look up the biodiversity metric user guide for all the different types of habitat. I think it's an annex to the user guide. And in fact, it lists about 80 different habitats. And they all have a value between 0 and 8. So ordinary grassland has a value of 2 in our example. The next one is the condition of the habitat. And that can vary between 1 and 3, depending if it's poor, moderate, or good condition. So let's say we're in the middle and we have our land in moderate condition. By the way, if your land is more than 1 habitat, you'll have to work each one out separately and add them together. The final one, which doesn't actually affect the metric very much, is its strategic significance. So if the local authority, for example, thinks it's sufficiently important to mention the existing habitat in its plan as something it doesn't want to lose, then that will make your score a bit higher. So you'll have to provide more to offset that, but not much higher, only 15% higher. So let's say it is not mentioned in the plan. So that's 1. So our biodiversity metric score in units is 1 times 2 times 2 times 1, which is 4. So we're going to have to improve some land either on site or off site, such that the increase is at least 4.4, in other words, 10% more than 4. And how do you calculate this improvement? Well, it's the same 4 things for the before score multiplied together, but discounted by 3 further things. These are the difficulty of creating the habitat. And this, I had originally thought that this was something that your ecologist could give you an opinion on, but actually it's listed in the metric how difficult each type of habitat is to create. But if it's already been created, then that won't be discounted. But some of the very high distinctiveness habitats can be as difficult as meaning a discount of 10. Sorry, I'll start again. The difficulty can be such that it makes your score 1/10 of what it would have been otherwise. So in other words, you have to have 10 times as much land to compensate for that. So let's say in our example, it's a medium difficulty to create the habitat when you look it up. So that's a 2/3 discount, 0.67. The second one is a temporal score, is how long it will take to create this habitat. So it doesn't have to be available already. And in fact, it can take any length of time to create. Presumably the local authority will have to be satisfied that that will actually happen. And the discount stops getting greater if it's going to take at least 30 years to create. You look up in the metric how much you have to multiply your figure by, depending on the number of years. So let's say it's going to take 2 years to create this habitat. You look up and you get a value of 0.967. So not too much of a discount there. And the final one is a spatial discount. This is how far away the biodiversity gain land you're creating is from your development. And it's fairly crude. It is not discounted even if it's anywhere in the same local authority area. So it could be quite a long way away, yet still in the same area. It's 0.75 if it is in the neighboring area, and this is at the district level, and it is 0.5 if it's anywhere further away. So if your development is in Cornwall, and anywhere else in Cornwall for your biodiversity gain land, that's no discount. If it's at least, if it's 2 local authorities away, or even in Cumbria or Northumberland, that will only be a half is the discount. You multiply your value by 0.5. Now I'm going to go on about why this spatial discount has changed in the latest version of the metric, which means it doesn't have such an effect on your score. So if in our example it was going to be medium difficulty, take 2 years, and be in the neighboring local authority to create the habitat of condition of moderate condition, you will need 2¼ hectares. If you started with 1 hectare, you're going to have to find 2¼ hectares. So in most cases, you're going to need more land than you started with. So this is a new feature. Let's just go to this change to the metric. So shortly after I gave my last webinar, Natural England published a new version of the metric. It was on 3.1 and is now on 4.0. So you need to refer to that one when you're doing any calculations. Most of the changes were pretty minor. It was sort of more guidance, more explanation how to use it. And there were some new habitats listed. So there are now a whopping 80 different habitats. But there was one change to this calculation. Now, I have a maths degree and I had a little difficulty working out what this change actually means. But I think that the discount, the spatial discount, that last one on the previous slide, only applies to the increase in the score, not the whole score. So if, for example, the land you're about to build on has a score of 4 units, and before the spatial discount, the after score has a score of 6 units. If it's in the neighboring local authority area, that is normally 3/4 discount, but you don't apply that to the whole of the 6, you only apply it to the 2 that the 6 is greater than the 4, if you see what I mean. So the increase in score there is 2. So previously the whole of the 6 would have been multiplied by 3/4 and get 4.5, but now since you're only discounting the 2, the score is 5.5, so it's higher. So the spatial discount has been reduced. So the implication is that if the land is further away, it doesn't affect the score too much. I think this is because there was a lot of feedback that we have big projects in the country that it would make sense if lots of developments together improved some huge habitat somewhere. There'd be sort of economies of scale. So it shouldn't be too much of a penalty if your if your land is further away. So that's the one change to the metric. I thought I'd also mention the small sites metric. There is a simpler metric for what are called small sites. These are the ones that BNG won't come into force mandatory mandatorily for until spring next year. A small site is if it's a residential project and you know the number of units, if it's between 1 and 9 units and less than 1 hectare in area. If you don't know the number of units, then it's less than half a hectare in area. And if it's not residential, then it is less than 100 square meters of floor space, or if you don't even know floor space, it's less than 1 hectare. That's what a small site is. So there is a separate small sites metric. It only applies in, you might not be able to use it even if you are a small site, because it only applies to the lower distinctiveness. You can only use it if your habitat is of lower distinctiveness 2 or 4, not if it's 6 or 8. The gain can only be on site as well. It can't be off site. It still involves most of the different things in the score, but they try and avoid the distinctiveness value, even though you have to work out that you're not higher than 4. You don't use it in the multiplier. It just tells you what you can do with a certain distinctiveness. So you can either keep it the same distinctiveness or improve it to 1 above. If you were level 2, you can go up to 4. If you're level 4, you have to keep at 4. If you're going up to a higher one, you'd have to use the main metric. So it's worth mentioning that this does exist for small sites, although it isn't actually that different. Now, the government reported on its consultation that it held last year in February of this year, which I covered in the previous webinar. You can look at the recording if you didn't attend it. And it listed a whole number of things that it would do between then and when BNG came into force this November. There are 15 things by my calculation, and I don't think it's done any of them yet. And yet, 3 months, over 3 months have gone past. So there are 4 consultations promised, one on what is irreplaceable habitat. So this is habitat that is so significant that the metric doesn't even apply to it, and there'll be a whole separate regime. The typical example, the classic example, is ancient woodland, but that will be consulted on. Then whether variations of planning permissions should attract biodiversity net gain or not, that'll be a consultation. For those in the world of DCOs and the Planning Act 2008, there will be a consultation on a statement that will be effectively assumed to have been inserted in all national policy statements about biodiversity net gain. And finally, any changes required to national policy, which I think it means the National Planning Policy Framework, for example, will be consulted upon. Special words for biodiversity net gain. There will be guidance on what legal agreements must contain for land to go on the biodiversity gain register, and and there'll be a template on the habitats management and monitoring plans, which I'll mention in a moment. Guidance on what is appropriate off-site biodiversity net gain, on conservation covenants and planning obligations, which I'll also cover in a minute. The stacking of payments, so that's, can I earn money for using land for somebody's BNG, for somebody's development for BNG, and also earn money for it on it for something else. There'll be guidance on what you can do that, what will be allowed and what won't be allowed. Finally, that last resort use of biodiversity statutory credits, there'll be guidance on that. 6 more things that aren't consultational guidance. So conservation covenants are a new thing that the Environment Act introduced, and yet you can't have any yet because you have to enter into a covenant with what's called a responsible body, and the government has not yet allowed anyone to apply to become a responsible body. The consultation response said this would become available in early 2023. It's definitely not early 2023 anymore, but it still hasn't happened yet. I heard more recently that it might be by the end of this month. The actual legal regulations that underpin the Environment Act have not yet been published. Surely they are going to be in the next couple of months so that people can prepare. A template for what you have to have signed off with the local authority will be provided. There is a draft template in the original consultation document from last year. The price of a biodiversity credit, the value of 1 unit, will be, well, it's said by 6 months before BNG comes into force. So that ought to have been by the end of May, if it was coming in November, but it is no longer May. So that's obviously not happened, but hopefully will be soon, and that'll be reviewed every 6 months. The fee for registering land on the biodiversity register needs to be announced, but we have been told it will be between £100 and £1,000. And finally, the register itself will open, and I've heard that it will be by November, but I would hope it open a bit before the whole thing comes into force. Otherwise, there'll be no time to put land on it. Okay. This slide applies to developers who want to make a planning application from November when BNG comes into force, or for a small site from spring next year. So with your application, you must put in an extra document called a BNG statement. What this must contain will be set out in the regulations, but is expected to include at least 3 or possibly these 4 things. The first one is you must calculate the value of the land you're about to build on, the biodiversity metric score in units, and provide that. It says in one place in the consultation response that you will have to say what steps you've taken to minimize adverse biodiversity impacts, but then in another place it doesn't mention that, so maybe that will be in, maybe it won't. But you can see that there's an incentive to try not to have adverse biodiversity impacts. Then you have to say what your approach was to enhancing land on site. So again, that incentivizes you to do your improvements on site rather than off site. But I suppose you could say, well, I just didn't bother, and I'm going with off site, I suppose. Then, as far as you know at the time you make your application, what you are proposing to rely on in terms of off-site enhancements or use of statutory credits, if you have planned anything or arranged anything so far. It does say that this BNG statement needs to have further information if you're making an outline application or an application for implementing something in phases, because you're going to have to say what's going to happen at each phase in terms of biodiversity net gain, and so anything that's staged has to provide more information. Then you might be a bit of toing and froing, but you may get your permission. But before you can start your development, you have to agree a biodiversity gain plan with the local authority. And that is a much more lengthy document than the BNG statement. There is a draft template in the consultation document, as I mentioned. It's 9 pages long, and that's empty. So your actual plan will be much longer. Incidentally, it does say that the BNG statement should, or it suggests, will include the first few headings of the gain plan. So it's a sort of shortened version of the gain plan. And that is the thing that must be agreed with the local authority before the development can commence. But after that, you are able to start implementing it. Obviously, you will have to do what you've said in your plan in terms of providing a habitat somewhere that will improve or has improved by at least 10% more than the habitat you're using up. Right, from the other side, if you're a landowner or a broker or somebody who is offering land on behalf of a landowner, this is what we know about what you have to do so far. You're going to have to put land on the register, but first I must emphasize, I think it is very important that you need to calculate and record the pre-improvement condition of the land, because you're going to have to prove that you have improved it from one condition to another, one distinctiveness to another, whatever. So you'll need some evidence of that, possibly by an ecologist, photographs, something down in writing that shows what the pre-improvement condition of the land was. Can't just improve it and say, yes, I assure you it was in a terrible condition previously. You must then put land on the Biodiversity Gain register, which, according to the webinar I attended, will open by November, which sounds a bit last minute, so I hope it'll be earlier. Otherwise, there will hardly be time for any land to be on it by the time developers must find some land somewhere. And there will be a fee of between £100 and £1,000. And these are the things you need to provide to put land on the register. 6 things. The first one is simply information about the land, i.e. where is it and what is it. So a plan of its boundary, the red line boundary, a grid reference of the middle of it, and its area in hectares. The second thing, that was really 3 things, but that's regarded as a single thing, information about the land. Second thing is, if you are not the landowner, you need to demonstrate you have the consent of the landowner to put the land on the register. You have to demonstrate that the landowner does own the land, but that can simply be done by providing the land registry title for the land, or titles. You then have to work out the biodiversity metric for the land, which is in the form of a spreadsheet. I presume it won't have the spatial discount in it because it doesn't know what development land it is going to apply to, so therefore doesn't know how far away that is. But you should be able to work out all the other elements of the metric. You then need a habitat management and monitoring plan. So, as the name suggests, that is presumably how you are going to manage the habitat and monitor that it is being maintained in the distinctiveness and the condition that you have promised. There will be a template to come about this, supposedly, so watch out for that. And the final one is a legal agreement that guarantees that these enhancements will be secured for 30 years. There are 2 options. I had wondered whether it was the legal agreement referred to as something that sat above these, but it actually just is one of these. So either a Section 106 agreement, which those in the world of planning will be very familiar with, or this new thing, the Conservation Covenant, which actually is a bit like a Section 106 agreement in that it runs with the land, but is specially for conserving land in a habitat rather than applying to a development. But as I said, you can't actually create one of those yet. Obviously, as a lawyer, I'm interested in the legal agreement that everyone will need. And we will be very keen to provide you with such advice on drafting such agreements. So finally, how am I doing for time? Okay, I've got 22 minutes. Finally, there are going to be a number of template documents, and we are going to try and develop these insofar as they haven't been just simply provided by the government. So there will need to be templates for the BNG statements. Those are the ones that you provide with your planning application. The Biodiversity Gain plan, the fuller plan that you need to be signed off by the local authority before you can commence your development. There'll need to be a template for conservation covenants. Another one for Section 106 agreements, although there is a fairly standard form for Section 106 agreements, these will be special ones that apply for Biodiversity Net Gain. Habitat management and monitoring plans. There will be a government template, but perhaps we can add a bit of value to that and have more detail, make it easier to fill in. And finally, although not mentioned in any of the previous, in any of the government's material, there will need to be some sort of agreement between the developer and either the habitat manager or the landowner, or indeed all three, because the developer is going to be on the hook for maintaining this land in its new habitat condition and distinctiveness, but may not actually be doing it itself. So there will need to be some sort of linkage between whoever is doing that legally. So I think that is something else that needs to be in place before a developer can, with confidence and even a local authority maybe, agree to the plan. So this is going to be a sort of, rather than a very high level of legal advice type of area, it's going to be perhaps a commoditized area of legal advice with fixed price documents. So we're looking into that. Watch out on our website for these as they become available. I was also somewhat dismayed to hear in the demonstration of the Biodiversity Gain Register that this was not intended to be the marketplace for biodiversity gain land. So if you're a developer looking for my biodiversity gain land, they're not expecting you to look on this register, which just seems crazy to me. That is such an obvious place for this buying and selling of land. But if they are relying on the private sector to provide such a marketplace, then that's something I'm quite interested in, because it's going to have to be done somewhere. Maybe that the register will become the marketplace even if it is not intended to be. But if it's supposed to be private enterprise that's producing this marketplace, and you're interested in doing that, then let me know. But if it's going to be lots of different separate companies with different bits of land all over the place, that's going to be very messy and not be a very good market. So I hope the government relents on that and tries to make the register more usable as a marketplace. But if not, someone else will have to provide that. So that is the end of my presentation. My last slide has a few useful links that I've collected together, although they're on previous slides. I will now look at the Q&A and spend the remaining time. Oh, I've got my other polls, haven't I? So I've got two more polls. So before I start the Q&A, let's have the second poll on how prepared you think you are for the introduction of BNG. Do you think you are prepared, you're not prepared, or you are somewhat prepared? Let us know. I'll keep that up for a moment while I burble on. So let's look at these questions. Right, first question. Just like carbon credits, biodiversity credits are really gaining traction as the world recognizes the vital role of ecosystem services and natural capital. Well, I think people are in for a shock when the value of a biodiversity credit is announced, actually. I have heard anything from 50,000 to over £100,000 for a single credit, which is going to concentrate the mind when that is published. We shall see what the government comes up with. In the initial consultation back last year, there was an impact assessment which had a sort of value of the buying and trading of units, so a single unit, and they varied between about £2,000 and £50,000. And these credits are supposedly going to be very expensive so that they do not interfere with the creation of the market. So expect to be paying big bucks for those. Next question. Oh, shall we have a look at the result of that poll? So only 11% of people think they are prepared. A third are not prepared, and the remainder are somewhat prepared. That's not too surprising. Next question is about BNG will apply to DCOs, but what is the position about TWAO applications? So that is applications under the Transport and Works Act 1992 for things, as the name suggests, for transport projects and works projects. So that's an interesting question. At the moment, BNG only applies to the town and country planning regime and the development consent order regime. It does not apply to any other consenting regime. So if, for example, you're seeking an order under the Highways Act and you do not need planning permission, then you won't need to provide BNG. However, I'm not sure what the position is going to be where, like a Transport Works Act order, where you can deem planning permission. Does that mean that is effectively a planning permission for the purposes of BNG? So we don't quite know yet. We'll have to wait and see what the regulations say, whether another regime that deems planning permission might have to provide BNG. Considering that they are sort of bigger projects generally, it would be a bit surprising if they managed to avoid providing BNG. So I would expect they probably will. But if you're completely outside, you're a separate consent to town and country planning or DCO, then you will not at the moment have to provide it. Is BNG an echo from EU membership? Are we seeing similar requirements introduced across the EU? Well, it certainly was contemplated while we were still leaving the EU, at least. I am afraid I don't know whether it is being introduced across the EU. In a separate set of webinars, I am talking about the replacement for environmental impact assessment, the so-called EORs, environmental outcome reports, which do correspond to the EU version. But as far, I'm not particularly aware of this being an EU derived measure. It seems it could well be UK derived, but that doesn't mean that there isn't something equivalent in other countries as well. I might have a little look, and when I answer in writing, see if I can find anything. Next, how does the spatial discount interact with the use of biodiversity credits, please? So biodiversity credits are the throwing money at the problem by just paying the government. So if your before value, say that you're going to build on some land and you calculate the score as 5 biodiversity units, you will presumably have to buy 5.5 biodiversity credits from the government, whatever the value of one credit is, and the cost of one credit times 5.5. The spatial discount will not be involved in that. So although I'm fairly sure there will be actual land improved behind the scenes somewhere by the government, you don't need to know where that is, and it'll be neutral as to where it is. As far as I'm aware, that's how it's going to work. So if coincidentally the land happened to be in the same local authority area, that wouldn't mean you didn't have to pay so much. I think it'll be just a black box that you put your money in and you don't see it again. But presumably, I mean, I think this is another opportunity for for landowners and brokers. The government will have to find this land somewhere, but I'm not sure how they are going to do that. Does the replacement habitat have to be in the UK? Actually, two points I haven't made is what is the transition? If you've already made your application by November, will you have to provide BNG? As far as I know, no. The trigger will be that on the start date, say that's the 9th of November, if you make your application on the 8th of November, you don't have to provide mandatory BNG, although, of course, a lot of local authorities have policies that you should provide BNG, but those are not the actual law. So you could, if you had lots of great benefits in some other area, you might be able to trade away that BNG. You won't be able to do that after the 9th of November. You will have to demonstrate you're providing the 10% BNG. The second question is, what is the extent of this obligation? Well, the relevant part of the Environment Act applies to England and Wales. So I think that means that the replacement habitat also has to be in England and Wales. So it probably can't be in Scotland or Northern Ireland even. Definitely not outside the UK. Next one, the discount. Isn't it really a penalty as the result is the applicant has to produce more land? That is correct, yes. Yes, the word discount sounds like a sort of good thing. If you go to a shop and get a discount, that's good. But actually, I mean that the biodiversity metric score in units is discounted, i.e. becomes smaller, and therefore you have to provide more land to compensate. So if your habitat was, you scored it as 10, but then the length of time it's going to take, you look up the table and it's a 0.5 multiplier for the number of years, then that reduces your value down to 5. So you're going to have to provide twice as much land in that habitat to make it back up again. So perhaps I should stop using the word discount in the future. Some other word that means your score gets smaller, a diminution in the score. Is that better? That will have to be offset by increasing the amount of land. Can BNG be achieved as a result of putting solar panels on roofs of big logistics sheds and harvesting electricity, for example? Well, I think I will have to look up the, or you might have to look up the biodiversity metric documentation for the different types of habitat. But certainly when I was looking at the small sites metric, it does talk about habitats on roofs. So they do have a score. So you might be able to, but this is asking about solar panels. No, I don't think solar panels themselves will have a score because we're talking about living things here. However, you might be able to have a green roof or something like that that will have a score. But we're talking about living things, and the habitat is also to do with the type of land rather than what's living in it. The habitat doesn't seem to care whether it's absolutely chock full of insects and birds and bees or whether it doesn't have any. As long as it is the right type of grassland or scrub or whatever, then that's all you need to provide. But the hope is that if it is in that form and you have not got anything that's going to discourage creatures from living in it, like shooting rights or lots of people walking all over it or something like that, then they will build it and they will come. Can you count the land from which you have improved to offset your carbon for other metrics, such as progress towards your net zero targets as part of your BNG? For example, if you plant 10,000 trees on an area of land to offset your carbon emissions, can you use the same land area, the same activity as part of your BNG target? Like that word stacking that I mentioned earlier, where you can earn money for using the land in two different ways and get two income streams. It is possible in some circumstances, but you'll need to look at the guidance for that in detail. Similarly, you can have the same land performing two different functions, and this is called additionality. However, there's an exception that at least 10% of the land must be BNG only. And again, there are some types of function that can't be also double counted for BNG. So again, you'll need to read the detail for that. But they want 10% of it to be BNG only, even when you can use the rest of it for something else. So that's a partial yes, in fact a 90% yes. Given your still to come slide and all the work still to be done by DEFRA, do you think the start of BNG may be delayed? Well, I have to say that the more time passes and things don't happen, that begins to start looking likely, doesn't it? Although when I attended the BNG register demonstration, that was only 2 weeks ago, and it was still all geared towards BNG coming into force in November, only then. But given that there are 15 things still to come and none of them have come, the pressure will be to have a delay, I think, so that we'll have to look out for that. The crunch will come when the regulations come out. So maybe the whole thing will be delayed, but I don't think it will be a significant delay. It might be that the whole lot get delayed till spring 2024, along with a small sites metric, something like that. But at the moment, the official line is still, it's November. So please plan for that, but we shall see. Is a conservation covenant to be added to the land registry title records? Well, yes, it will be a land charge like a Section 106 agreement. So it has many of the features of Section 106 agreements. And that is one of them. And running with the land is another one. So if the land changes hands, the conservation covenant still applies to it, in other words. Re-putting land on the register, there has to be a Section 106 or conservation covenant. Section 106s are only enforceable by the local planning authority within which the land is situated. So what happens when the gain land? Well, that is a very good question that I think is a bit of a flaw in this process. So remember my example that you're developing some land in Cornwall and your biodiversity gain land is in Northumberland. Your planning permission with the compulsory condition is granted by by Cornwall Council. So they are in charge of enforcing it. Are they really going to go up to Northumberland and check that your land is in the new state? So maybe the cost of any travel that the local authority will have to incur will have to be part of the costs of any agreement you reach with them. Or are they going to make some agreement with Northumberland Council to monitor the land on their behalf? That doesn't seem to have been worked out yet. That is going to be very interesting. I mean, because it's a condition that is on your condition that was granted by the development site local authority, it is them who is supposedly going to enforce it, even if it's outside their area. But so that does rather extend the scope of what they are responsible for. But again, watch this space on the regulations. How are we doing for time? We have 2 minutes. So I'm going to start the final poll, which is, are these webinars helpful? I'm a bit nervous about this one. If you'd like me to do more of these, I will do them probably every 6 weeks to 2 months up until we get to November, or whenever the start of BNG actually is. If you don't like these webinars, I'll have to go to a whole new audience. So we'll have that for a moment. I think I'll leave the questions there. There are quite a few more. I'm sorry I didn't manage to answer them during the webinar, but I will receive the text that you asked, and I will answer them in writing and submit that with the slides in the next couple of days. So what's the answer? Oh, good, 100%. Oh, bless you. Thank you very much. 100% that they are useful. So I now gonna have to do more of them. There we go. Okay, well, thank you very much for attending. As I say, you will get follow-up versions of the slides and answers to the questions in due course. If you would like me to do one of these webinars for your organization, I have done a few already. I'm very happy to do that. It can be much more interactive, and you can be asked more embarrassing questions because nobody else will know about them. Do let me know. But until we meet again, thank you very much for joining, and see you all again soon. Thank you and have a good day.